everyone. And thanks for your patience. So it's always good, I think, to have a little Darwin. You know, I tell my students they read the Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, and I tell them, you know, every paragraph there's a dissertation. You know, there's just like a lot of stuff in there. And you know, Darwin had some things to say here about us in groups and why we are what we are, and what might be some things that could have some evolutionary pressure as far as some of our behavioral things might go. And you know, we see little clues everywhere about some of these things. So, you know, I was just watching another documentary on Ötzi the other day. So Ötzi gets pulled out of the ice in 1991. They think he's a hiker, and turns out Ötzi is about 5,000 years old. And one of the interesting things about Ötzi was that he was buried with a lot of his stuff. And what they found about 10 years after they dug up the body was the fact that Ötzi was murdered. So basically there was an arrow in the back, and that was it. They didn't take his axe, which were hard to make back then, those copper axes, or any of his other stuff. So he was basically shot in the back with an arrow and then bashed over the head and left to die, buried in the snow. 5,000 years later, he comes out. So what does this tell us about human behavior, evolution, survival, and the importance of facial recognition? Well, one of the things is our nonverbal communication systems are clearly older than our verbal communication systems. If you actually look at our species, depending on, you know, what information you want to see, some form of us has been around 6, maybe 8 million years or whatever. But if you're looking at Homo sapiens, as in us specifically, 100 to 200,000 years. And if you look at the biology of throat structures and things like this, probably only us, maybe Neanderthal, were capable of articulate speech. So what this means is we had to communicate somehow. We were, you know, we are social animals. Social animals have to communicate to be social. Can't be social without communicating. So therefore, our primary systems were nonverbal. And one of the things that I want to sort of look at a little bit is to see how evolution may push us towards certain things in the nonverbal domain. And I'm going to focus on one particular today because it's the topic of the talk, which is the facial recognition part. Okay? Why might this be an important thing? Why might we have this ability to recognize faces? Why may this be hardwired into us? Well, you know, as Darwin said, talking about groups working together and so on and so forth, and it suggests that maybe the ability to recognize people within our groups, whatever, may be an important characteristic. Now, one of the things we have to think about is when we talk about evolution, we really are talking about the world of 100,000 plus years ago. This is what we evolved for. Now, the extent to which our things work today is great, but we weren't sort of designed to learn to be afraid of electrical outlets, right? We learn to be afraid of other things, and we can transfer it to electrical outlets and know not to stick our fingers in them, right? But we didn't have any sort of evolutionary pressure towards that particular thing. So when we think about ourselves, we have to say, you know, this is kind of what we were wired for, was that world, the savannah of 100,000 or so years ago. And there were a number of things that we needed to solve, and we call it the 4 Fs, in order to survive. And thank you for getting the joke. It takes but there are 2 tasks we need to do: survive to reproductive age, and then sort of demonstrate reproductive fitness so that our genes can be carried on to the next generation. This is all sort of you know, fairly standard stuff when you think about evolutionary psychology. And one of the things that helps us meet these 2 goals is our ability, our hardwired abilities to recognize faces, right? Now you may say, okay, how? Well, if you dial it back a little bit, the ability to recognize identity, who you are, is extraordinarily important. And in the following sense, our current world is not nearly as nasty as the ancient world. And knowing who people were in the ancient world was a life or death judgment, right? So therefore, there could be some evolutionary pressure to do this, right? So recognition, who is in your group, who is not in your group. You know, Darwin talked about it. I mean, we can see this in chimpanzee behavior. I mean, one of the things that Jane Goodall revealed was chimpanzees are nasty. Now, I always think they're cute. They wear hats, they ride a bike, you see them in the zoo. But then, you know, Jane Goodall seeing them in the field, she finds the male chimpanzees walk around in troops, they patrol the edge of the territory, and God help another chimpanzee not part of their group. They will try to kill them. And if they're infants, they eat them, right? I mean, it's pretty horrid stuff. But they're like street gangs. They wander around and they patrol the territory and they do that kind of stuff. So if you're in the group or you're not in the group, that turns out to be extraordinarily important. It is life and death. Right? So this sort of in-group, out-group, and our propensity to make these things is in fact one of the most replicated findings in all of social psychology. I know it says communication, but I'm a social psychologist, right? So, and even when you divide people on the most mundane characteristics. Here's a sheet of paper with a whole bunch of dots. How many do you think are on it? You say, oh, I don't know, 1,000. Oh, well, guess what? You're a low estimator. You go in the low estimator group. Someone else says 1,000. Oh, well, you're high. It doesn't matter what you say. You're just put in the group. Dot estimation. What happens? All of a sudden, the guys, if you're a low estimator, you know, us low estimators are kind of cool. You know, we're sort of interesting and complicated. But those high estimators, they're just kind of, you know, we start drawing distinctions on the most silly characteristics. So it's clearly something about us, them, recognizing this stuff is extraordinarily important. And if you actually sort of dial it back even a little further, if you look at the skeletons of males you find buried from ancient societies or wherever you can, and you can often ascertain the cause of death based on the breaks, when they occurred, did they survive from them. And one of the interesting things is you find about 30% of males in ancient society died from homicide. The other thing you see in ancient cities is they all have walls. Now, why do they have walls? It's not to keep people in, right? It's to keep people out. And one of the things I think that was not fully appreciated in a lot of anthropologists thought, well, warfare happens here and there a little bit. It wasn't that big a deal. No, this was a daily thing. And think about it, just about one out of every 3 of you males, you leave the planet at the hands of another male, typically. Even going in the 70s, Napoleon Chagnon's work with the Yanomamo, right? 25% of those males die via homicide, okay? And think about that, that's an extraordinary number. And in fact, one of the things we tried to do is we said, well, let's go look at something pretty awful. World War II, a lot of people, millions of people died. Okay? What country was affected the most in terms of the male population? It was the Soviet Union, and it was around 12% of the males were killed in the war. Now that's half the rate of the Yanomamo in the 1970s, less than the ancient society. And in fact, if you assume around 4 million males in New York City, this is how I derive this number. So just so you have something to compare to 25 and 30 and 12, is 0.0085% in terms of the homicide currently now in New York. So again, and Steve Pinker makes this point, we like to think things are getting more awful, and that's only because we've got cable TV and lots of media outlets now. So if it bleeds, it leads, right? So we tend to overestimate the amount of it. But we're certainly much sort of kinder beasts than we were. But what this is trying to tell us is that being wired for identity, who you are, and making that judgment, there is evolutionary pressure because that is life or death. That's why. We don't think of it as such, but it really is. And again, we did a study. This is one of my master's or doctoral students. This was his master's thesis. And we said, well, if it's that important, what is the first thing we do when we see another human being, right? Studying emotion and stuff, we always said, okay, they're angry, they're not. We read them, we react to them. But I realized that's actually not the first judgment we make. When we see a face, the first thing we say is, do I know you? Then, what's your mood state? And so Zach Carr did this little experiment where we showed famous and unfamous people. There are 2 famous people there in the picture there. It's because we showed it to both Asians and Caucasians. So we got Yao Ming, if you can't recognize, Justin Timberlake. And we asked people the question, do you know this person, yes or no? Is this person feeling an emotion, yes or no? So 2 dichotomous judgments. And people were much faster on do I know you, yes or no? Okay, so it was about 1,700 milliseconds, which is about 1.7 seconds, right? Somewhere along the line. Whereas, are they feeling something is about 2.5 seconds. Okay, so it's just in terms of reaction time and the judgments you make, this is a much quicker one. We had also unfamous people, by the way, not just simply famous people. So, do you recognize them? Yes, no, that kind of business. So clearly there's something in this that's wired with us, for us. And not only that, you can get a little biological on this, and you find that there's actually sections of the brain that are devoted to recognition of faces. The fusiform gyrus. Gyrus is the bone, for those who don't know. And when people have damage in that area, they can't recognize faces. Prosopagnosia, it's called. Right? You can literally show them pictures. Here's Martin Luther King, and they'll go like, it looks familiar. Show the president, I think. Then you show them their own picture. He looks familiar. Right? I mean, it's a really interesting phenomenon. One of my colleagues, Nancy Etkoff, who's somewhere here in the area, had worked with patients like that. And she says, you know, she worked with a patient for 20 years. And only when she speaks does he then recognize her, right? So again, there's areas of the brain, we're looking at the pattern, you know, identity, recognizing people, and facial recognition is obviously an extraordinarily important part of our evolutionary history, right? And the thing about it, which we're all capitalizing on now, like looking at this, being able to recognize faces, it's sort of a downstream activity or a down current. It's, you know, when you're kind of going with your biology, it always feels good, right? And so this is what we naturally do. When we see somebody, we don't quickly look at their feet and say, who is that, right? We look in the face. That's why your ID cards don't have pictures of your hands. They have pictures of your face, right? Because this is what we do. And so therefore, it became the obvious place to look when you're starting to do what you folks are doing, or a lot of the people are doing, is automating this stuff, right? Because it's comfortable. We're used to it. This is good. This is the, but we're capitalizing on how we are wired. Okay? Now, I don't want to sort of try to oversell the point that, oh, you know, we're victims of our biology. In fact, the exact opposite. I think one of the things that made us survive as a group is we learned to do things like share food when we wanted to eat it all, and not kill people who got us angry, who were part of our group, and so on and so forth. So this is where our greatest triumphs come from, is overriding this. So don't think I'm thinking we're just these sort of prisoners of our impulses, right? Because not all of our impulses are successful, or helpful. Like, that's an ice cream sundae in there, you know? That's a downstream activity. Eating lots of ice cream and feeling good, but over the long haul, that's not going to be good for us, right? So not all of the things that are easy are actually good. Okay? So what implications does this have as far as facial recognition? I think, first off, if you're doing stuff in this area, there's obviously a ready public acceptance of this, because this is what we do. It's comfortable, right? We don't have to tell people, oh, now you got to go up and smell people or something, you know, which we not normally do, or something unusual that way, right? And by the way, we're good at this too. We can distinguish faces as human beings really well, particularly if it's within your own ethnic group. We tend to lag a little bit if it's not our own ethnic group, right? It's called cross-race ID issues. And in fact, there are different places people look in the faces. Caucasians tend to take a wider view when they look at a face and try to recognize it, whereas African Americans and Asians tend to look more in the triangle here, along those lines. Okay? The other thing about what we do is our skill set is robust to conditions, unlike what Marie was talking about. You know, if I turn my face this way, you still know it's me, right? To a computer says, hey, your eyes are squishing together. I don't know if I know you, right? They're dealing in a two-dimensional world, but we make the adjustment like this. Lighting, I can tell, it's still you, right? The other thing that advantage of this stuff, of course, is because of the uniqueness and our abilities to recognize this stuff. You know, this is a comfort level. We carry around here's our ID and my password. It's right here. I don't have to remember the darn thing, right? And again, Jim's always 2 steps ahead of me. So in his intro, he's already talking about there's also good and bad things about this stuff, right? So for example, you know, children get lost. You use facial recognition technology, put their little picture in and find them in the mall. Or you always have these studies of either Alzheimer's or elderly who get lost, people don't know where they are, that kind of stuff. Maybe this can help us do that. On the flip side, the bad guys, the terrorists, people with warrants for their arrest and those sorts of things. And this could be a very useful technology on this. Right? But there are cons to this. Again, things that are easy for our brains to do are hard for automated systems. And by the way, the other way around too. We did a study looking at the flow of expressions. And I coded that by hand. It took me 6 months to code 44 subjects. And then I collaborated with a computer science team at UC San Diego, Javier Movean, Marnie Bartlett, and Gwen Littlewart, and they produced that in seconds. It took me 6 months to do, right? And they didn't know what the significance was. So the behavioral scientists, you know what this means? They go, no. And I told them. And so we actually created a search system, which is now used. It's called Facet, a few other things. But it's about, you know, adjusting and using this automated system, we were able to tell the difference between real and fake pain at 85%. Using the system and learning the difference between an actual real pain expression, which was a cold pressor task, and a fake pain where you stick it in lukewarm water and pretend you're in pain. Okay? But again, we humans can do some of this stuff real easy, and the machines can't. Now, humans trying to judge real and fake pain only got 55% correct. So the machine was picking it up, but the reason was the machine is picking up the flow. The key difference in real and fake pain was not the presence of which movement, but it was the flow of the movement, of specific movements. That was the distinction here, right? And of course, Jim also way ahead of me on this. You know, what do we do now when people capitalize on this? And I think people smarter than me probably have to wrestle with this. But you know, he talked about the shaming of people and so on. But one of the things we have to wrestle with is with these systems, they're not perfect, as Margaret was talking about. And what is the cost of a mistake? So I deal a lot with airport security people. And teaching was called a behavior detection program. And the cost of a mistake is a couple minutes of somebody's time, right? Uh-oh, that person, you go, you talk to them, resolve it, on they go. Or they're the ones who get the secondary screening. Okay, you get patted down and they open and go through your bags. That's the cost. In some other domains, the cost might be, if you're a sniper, the cost may be you kill an innocent person. Much higher cost, right? So as these technologies are employed, we're doing things that feel comfortable, but we have to ask ourselves, in what domain, what are the costs of making a mistake in any one of these things and anything? So again, the question we got to wrestle with, where is the line here? So, we can think again in terms of what kind of world. That's a genie trying to put himself back in a bottle. It's one of those things, if the technology's out there, someone will use it. That's just the way it goes, right? And so what do we do? What kind of a world do we ultimately want to do with this? There's pros and cons to all this stuff, and again, people smarter than me can wrestle with it. But I'm just going to end with the same Darwin quote that I started with, because if you look at this a different way, and think of it that, if you show fidelity, courage, sympathy for other people, and thinking about this, and think about how we classify the group, then maybe we'll make some good decisions about using this sort of stuff, rather than seeing it from the initial way when you read this Darwin, it's about good guys and bad guys, us and them. But maybe all of us and us, then maybe we do something a little bit different and maybe a little bit better for all of us. So, thank you.
I mean, this might be a bit of a joint question, but you said that your one program that looked at the flow of emotions was more accurate on the computer versus a human. And so I'm wondering, instead of using still images for facial recognition, if there's, or if maybe it's too much data so far, but to use video clips or brief, movements of the face to identify similarities between people and using, that kind of technology, if that exists or.
Yeah, we did try to convince some people to fund something like that, and because we also have styles of movement as another thing. So you can identify people by their gait. Yeah. We can identify deviations in their gait. If I strap things on you, so if I put a handgun on your ankle and have you walk, I can tell the difference, you with the handgun, you without, or a suicide vest, you with or without. The problem is that's a within-subject comparison. An airport's a between-subject comparison. So you don't want to get the guy with the arthritic hip, whom you then tackle to the ground because you think he's wearing a suicide vest when all he's got is a bum hip, right? So, but at the end of the day, the dynamics of this stuff, I think, does provide useful information on this. And ultimately, I think we have to, I don't know how well that works on the training, but I do know you want your technology, it's got to be able to do that down the line if you want it to be effective in all those domains.
As far as I know, currently with video, because it's just a collection of images, the video is split up into these separate images, and then you're combining the same person's images into a template again. So current systems not necessarily use the dynamics the way you're describing. So there's probably going to be improvement in video recognition.
Could you elaborate a little more on your definition of in-group, out-group? Because I can define myself as an in-group in terms of academic or in terms of being white or being male, whatever. So I was surprised that actually to see that the emotion came on a second level. And could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the interesting things is people can change teams. You go rich to poor, Democrat to Republican, and vice versa. You can't not be white, right? And this is where we see, when you look at totalitarians and things, is that people start to draw lines. When they draw them down to the immutable characteristics, sometimes that's where it becomes a little problematic, because then I can't be you, you can't be me at some point. So some people have argued that when we do talk about grouping, like they talk about it with like social programs, let's talk income, because that's something anyone can be at some point, right? But we do, we are, and in different domains, these become more or less salient, right? So, you know, what you're doing here, you think of what your group is, and then you have a hobby activity, the fellow hobbyists of whatever that you're doing, and so on and so forth. So it is fluid in terms of what we belong to. And it even goes back to Goffman's, the situated nature of the self. If I ask you, what 3 words would your best friend use to describe you? And then what 3 words would your mother use to describe you? They're often not the same words, okay? So, that's where we get into it. But yeah, it's a fluid group thing.
Have you ever tried to test your theories about detection of lying on actors?
Yes. To lay people, they're very good at doing it. But when we look at them, there's one thing to know what to do, and there's another thing to be able to do it. And some of the behavioral stuff that happens when people lie is involuntary. So it's the equivalent of, you're going to give the big presentation and your colleague comes up to you and says, don't worry, just relax. You say, oh my God, what a great idea. Of course you know the idea. The thing is, can you do it, right? So that's, but actors know, when it comes to fooling people with lying, you only have to do what people think liars do. You don't have to do what they really do, and that's good enough. So for example, most people think when people lie, they don't look you in the eye. Okay? In fact, they did a survey of 75 countries, 43 languages, and that's the #1 answer in every culture, what liars do. It gives them away, but it's not true. Although it is true for kids up to about 7 or 8, but those same kids, by the time they're 12 and 13, it no longer works. Because it's a controllable action, eye contact, and the parents and teachers say, look me in the eye and tell me you didn't make that mess. So kids learn from that. What do I need to do to fool people? Look them in the eye. But yet it does work for the average person if I look you in the eye, even though the science shows eye contact is not a good clue for detecting deception.
Right, so just to answer my question, you are not able to detect when actors are...
Yes, no, I said that we do.
You are able
Oh
to
yes,
detect
absolutely. We can. Average people can't. So if I show it to a group of undergraduates, like actors lying and telling the truth,
Yeah.
chance. Okay, no better than guessing. But if we analyze them and we put them under high enough stakes where we elicit emotions, yes, then we can get them, yes. I mean, not perfectly, but like 80, 75, 80%.
I'll just mention Professor Frank is one of the leading experts on lie detection. He's got a very carefully controlled laboratory at Buffalo where investigators come from all over the world to learn from him and his team about the micro displays of behavior that even the human eye can't detect in terms of lying. So we're very fortunate that we have such an expert to address your concerns.
Well, just know there's no Pinocchio response. We'll never have perfect lie detection, ever. But, we had a question earlier, yes?
Yeah, a lot of the behavioral detection systems have been critiqued as not being culturally sensitive, that in some cultures looking in the eye may be a sign of lying, in other cultures looking in the eye may be a sign of truth-telling. I'm curious as to how do you control for different cultural distinctions when developing behavioral detection methodology? And I'm also just curious what your direct application of fake pain is. What would be the real-world application for that?
Well, malingerers. People are always going to insurance companies and lawsuits saying, I've injured my neck, it's soft tissue, give me $10 million. Okay, we have commercials like that all the time. So that's one use of that. As far as the cultural stuff goes, one of the things we found is that the cultural stuff is not as big as we thought it would be, because when you look at things that happen when people lie, they boil down to 3 different processes. One, the management of emotions. The research suggests a lot of that is universal across culture. Second is thinking on your feet, cognitive activity. And the third would be memory-based stuff. Recalling something you've experienced versus inventing a story about something you didn't do. There's some differences there. And then overarching all of that is our attempts to manage, control, and conceal that stuff. And what we found so far is that seems to apply pretty much everywhere. There are big differences though. Sometimes you don't know if somebody does, somebody does this, what does that mean? Well, and sometimes it means they're angry because they're insulting you, right? But you just think they're just scratching their neck, right? So that's where the cultural misinterpretation comes in. And in fact, that was a really important part of a couple of government programs, just teaching them what these things mean. If you have someone come over like this, you've now insulted and that person will not talk to you. Because you basically said they're sexually loose instead of saying, well, my favorite example is this. All right, and in the US of A, you can do it either way. But when George Bush, and unfortunately his wife passed away yesterday, but when George Bush 41 was visiting Australia in January '92, and I was living out in Australia, and they were protesters, he's doing this. And in Australia, this means screw you. But he's smiling the whole time. Thinks he's going to peace, right? So how those stuff and how that works is problematic. But a lot of the basic principles did seem to extrapolate across cultures.
Thank you.
I don't remember exactly, but according to the last survey from the Pew, I would say that 15% of American people, they will improve their images through Photoshop or any of these technologies that make you look better, like your ideal self. What about the technology? I'm asking you for both of you because I know that many people is improving. Could you recognize that? Does fool the system or what?
I have a student doing a master's thesis on that, but the technical stuff I'm turning over to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends, but typically you can detect it, yes.
So do you recognize people who improve their images through any apps, for example, or Photoshop? Or
Yeah, I don't know if there are any studies on that, but I would say so, yeah.
But we can predict what they would do to make themselves look more attractive. So the eyes would get a little bigger, the nose a little smaller. There are principles that one can apply, yeah.
so you can recognize your master students of
No, we just will predict what they'll do. I don't know if we'll be able to recognize it.
very nice. Okay.
Yeah, that'll be up to you.
On that forward-looking note, in light of time, I think we're going to cut off Q&A at this point. But I, on behalf of our wonderful speakers, invite you to assault them with questions during upcoming coffee breaks and reception. But thank you for your questions, and thank you both once more.